He thought silence meant his son was unreachable, but he was about to learn he had never truly listened. The laughter came first, soft at the edges, then sharper, echoing through the marble dining hall where crystal glasses caught the golden light of chandeliers and reflected it like fractured stars. Guests in tailored suits and silk dresses leaned closer to one another, their voices lowered but not enough, never enough. "Does he even understand anything?" one woman whispered, her manicured fingers hovering over a glass of wine. Across the long table, Noah Romano sat perfectly still, his small hands resting on the polished wood, his eyes unfocused, as if the world around him moved in a language he was never taught to speak. The room was not quiet, not even close, but around the boy, there was a kind of emptiness that swallowed every word before it could reach him. Adrian Romano, seated at the head of the table, did not react. His expression remained carved from control, his jaw set, his gaze distant, as if the conversation unfolding around his son belonged to someone else's life. He had built an empire by mastering noise, negotiations, deals, power, but this silence, this unbreakable distance between him and his child, was the one thing he could not command. And so he ignored it, the same way he ignored the subtle shift of guests avoiding eye contact with the boy, the same way he ignored the way Noah flinched at vibrations he couldn't name. In the far corner of the room, Lena Carter stood beside a service cart, her hands steady as she refilled glasses that didn't need refilling, her presence as invisible as she had learned to be. She had been in the Romano estate for exactly 11 days, long enough to understand the rules that were never spoken out loud. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not interfere, and under no circumstance, do not approach the boy. But rules had a way of cracking when something inside you refused to stay quiet. Lena noticed the smallest details, the way Noah's fingers tapped lightly against the table, not randomly, but in rhythm, the way his eyes shifted toward the vibration of footsteps rather than the sound of voices, the way his shoulders tightened when laughter rose too suddenly, too sharply. It wasn't confusion. It was isolation, a different kind of listening. Another ripple of laughter broke across the table, louder this time, and Noah's hand froze mid-tap. He didn't look up. He didn't react. He simply withdrew, shrinking into a stillness so complete it felt like he disappeared while sitting in plain sight. And that was when Lena felt it, not as a thought, but as a pull, something instinctive and undeniable. She stepped forward before she realized she was moving, before she remembered the rules, before she considered the consequences. Her shoes made the faintest contact with the polished floor, a vibration more than a sound, and for the briefest second, Noah's fingers twitched again. Adrian's eyes lifted, slow and deliberate, locking onto her with a warning that didn't need words. The room shifted, the air tightening as conversations faded into cautious silence, all attention turning toward the one person who had just broken the unbreakable line. Lena didn't stop. She moved closer to the table, her heartbeat steady despite the weight of every gaze pressing down on her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Adrian's voice cut through the room, low, controlled, and unmistakably final. "Who told you to step forward?" But Lena didn't answer him. Her eyes remained on the boy, on the quiet rhythm that had just been interrupted, on the connection that no one else had even tried to understand. And for the first time in that house filled with power, wealth, and endless noise, someone chose to listen to the silence instead. The room did not breathe again until Adrian Romano stood up, slow and deliberate, his chair sliding back across the marble floor with a weight that everyone could feel even if they could not hear it. And in that moment, every guest straightened, every whisper died, because power did not need to raise its voice to be understood. It only needed to move. Lena felt it too, that shift in the air, the way attention sharpened like glass. But she did not step back. She did not lower her gaze, because the boy in front of her had not moved either, his small world still suspended in that fragile silence that no one else seemed willing to enter. Adrian took one step forward, then another, his presence closing the distance between them with controlled precision, his dark eyes fixed on Lena with a question that was not meant to be answered lightly. "Asked you something," he said, his voice calm, but edged with something colder than anger, something closer to certainty. Around them, the guests watched, some with curiosity, others with quiet anticipation, as if waiting for the moment she would be dismissed, corrected, erased back into the background where she belonged. Lena inhaled slowly, not to steady her nerves, but to anchor herself in the only thing that mattered in that moment, the boy whose fingers had not resumed their rhythm. She lowered herself, not in submission, but in intention, bending down until she was level with Noah's line of sight, her movements careful, deliberate, so that the air around him did not shift too suddenly. She did not speak. Instead, she reached out and gently tapped the edge of the table, once, twice, a soft, consistent vibration that traveled through the polished wood. For a second, nothing happened. Then Noah's fingers moved again. Not randomly, not by accident. They answered. A faint pattern, almost like an echo, tapped back against the surface, uneven at first, then steadier, as if something inside him recognized the rhythm and held on to it. The room remained silent, but this time it was different, not empty, not distant, but full of something no one could quite name. Adrian stopped mid-step. He did not interrupt. He did not speak. His eyes shifted from Lena to his son, watching with an intensity that stripped away everything else, the guests, the setting, the performance of control he had mastered for years. Lena continued, her hand moving slightly closer, tapping again, slower this time, giving space between each motion, allowing Noah to follow, to respond, to lead if he wanted to. And he did, his fingers pressed down, mimicking her pattern, then changing it, adding something of his own, a variation that was small but unmistakable. It was not a miracle. It was not sudden. It was simple, quiet, real. A conversation without words. Adrian's breath caught, barely noticeable, but enough. He had spent years hiring specialists, therapists, experts who spoke in structured plans and clinical language, all of them promising connection, none of them delivering this. Not this. Not something so immediate, so undeniable, so human. One of the guests shifted in their seat, uncomfortable now, unsure where to look because the boy they had just questioned moments ago was no longer invisible. He was present, and they had not seen him. Lena finally lifted her gaze, not toward the guests, not toward the room, but toward Adrian, meeting his eyes without challenge, without fear, only clarity. She did not need to explain. The answer was already there, in the space between each tap, in the quiet exchange unfolding in front of him. Adrian said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he spoke. Again, it was not a command. It was a request he had never learned how to make before. And Lena understood. Adrian did not move away. Not when the room shifted uncomfortably behind him. Not when the silence stretched long enough to make every guest aware that something irreversible had just begun. He stayed exactly where he was, watching the small exchange unfold, as if the entire world had narrowed down to the distance between Lena's hand and his son's fingertips. Again, he had said, but this time it carried weight. Not authority, not expectation, but something closer to uncertainty, a man asking for something he did not know how to hold. Lena nodded once, subtle and controlled, then returned her focus to Noah, who was no longer withdrawn into himself, no longer distant, but alert in a way that felt almost fragile, like a door that had been opened for the first time in years and could close just as easily if handled the wrong way. She tapped again, slower now, a pattern of 3, then pause, then 2, letting the rhythm breathe, letting it exist in the space rather than forcing it forward. Noah watched her hand, not her face, his eyes following the movement with careful attention, and then, after a moment that felt longer than it was, his fingers pressed against the table again, repeating the sequence, imperfect but intentional. A faint smile touched the corner of Lena's mouth, not wide, not exaggerated, but real, and Noah noticed his own expression shifting just slightly, the smallest lift that might have gone unseen by anyone who was not looking closely enough. Adrian saw it. That was what stopped him completely. Not the tapping, not the pattern, not even the response, but that change, that almost smile, something he had not witnessed in months, maybe longer. He had files, reports, expert opinions that described his son in terms of limitations, in terms of what he could not access, could not process, could not become, but none of them had ever captured this moment that did not feel clinical or managed or explained. It simply existed, and it existed because of her. One of the guests cleared their throat, attempting to reclaim the room, to shift attention back to the dinner. But the effort fell flat because no one could look away now, not without acknowledging what they had just missed before. Adrian lifted his hand slightly, a silent signal, and the staff immediately understood. Plates were cleared, voices softened, the performance of the evening quietly dissolving into something less structured, less controlled. He stepped closer to Lena, but this time there was no confrontation in his movement, only intent. "What are you doing?" he asked, and for the first time, there was no accusation in the question. Lena did not look away from Noah as she answered. "I'm giving him something he can feel before I ask him to understand," she said, her voice calm, steady, grounded in experience rather than theory. Adrian's brow tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in realization, the kind that arrives slowly but settles deeply. "They told me he needed words," he said, more to himself than to her. Lena shook her head gently. "Words come later," she replied. "Connection comes first." Noah tapped again, this time without waiting, a small, confident variation of the pattern they had started, and Lena followed, adapting, responding, letting him leave for the first time. Adrian exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and something in his posture shifted, subtle but undeniable, the rigid line of control softening just enough to make room for something unfamiliar. He lowered himself, not fully, but enough to bring himself closer to their level, his hand hovering above the table for a brief second before resting lightly on the surface, feeling the faint vibrations that had carried the conversation he had never been part of. Noah's eyes flickered toward him, not fully, not directly, but enough to acknowledge his presence in this new space, and Adrian stilled, afraid that even the smallest wrong movement could break whatever fragile bridge had just been built. Lena glanced at him then, just once, and in that look there was no fear, no hesitation, only a quiet invitation. Not to control, not to command, but to learn. And for the first time in a very long time, Adrian Romano did not know what to say, and more importantly, he understood that he did not need to. The dining room never returned to what it had been. Not that night. Not after the moment something invisible had shifted and refused to go back into place. And even as the staff moved quietly to clear the table and the guests began to gather their things with polite smiles that no longer held the same confidence, the center of the room remained unchanged, anchored by a boy who had finally been seen and a man who was just beginning to understand what that meant. Adrian remained beside the table longer than anyone expected, longer than protocol allowed, his attention fixed not on the people who had come for his approval, but on the small movements of his son's hands as they continued to tap. Slower now, softer, but still present, still alive with intention. Lena stepped back slightly, not to withdraw, but to create space, allowing Noah to continue without guidance, her eyes attentive but no longer leading. And for a few seconds, the rhythm existed on its own, fragile but real, like something learning how to stand for the first time. One of the senior guests approached Adrian cautiously, his voice low, careful. "Mr. Romano, should we continue in the lounge?" Adrian did not answer immediately. He did not look at the man. Instead, he watched as Noah's tapping paused, then resumed, this time with a slight change, a variation that suggested curiosity rather than repetition. Only then did Adrian respond, his voice quiet but absolute. "No." The single word carried more finality than any raised tone ever could, and the guest nodded, stepping back without question, understanding that whatever business had brought them there no longer held priority. The room began to empty, not with urgency, but with a kind of respectful hesitation, as if leaving too quickly might disrupt something they could not fully comprehend. When the last of them had gone, the silence that remained was different from before, no longer heavy or isolating, but open, like a space waiting to be filled with something new. Adrian finally shifted his gaze to Lena. "How long have you known?" he asked. She understood the question immediately. "Since I was a child," she said simply. Adrian's expression tightened slightly. "And no, one thought to tell me that this was possible." There was no anger in his voice, only the weight of missed time, of years spent searching in the wrong direction. Lena met his gaze calmly. "People told you what they understood," she replied. "Not what he needed." Adrian absorbed that in silence, the words settling deeper than he expected. He turned his attention back to Noah, who had now stopped tapping and was instead pressing his palm flat against the table, feeling the surface, exploring it in a way that suggested awareness rather than habit. Slowly, carefully, Adrian mirrored the movement, placing his own hand against the wood, not to interrupt, but to join. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then Noah's fingers shifted, brushing lightly against the edge of Adrian's hand, not fully touching, but close enough to acknowledge its presence. Adrian froze, not from fear, but from the realization that this was not something he could force or command. It had to be earned, moment by moment, without expectation. Lena watched quietly, her role now almost invisible again, but different this time, because what she had introduced could not be undone. "He feels you before he trusts you," she said softly. Adrian nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if committing the thought to memory. He did not look at her when he spoke next. "Stay." It was not a request. It was not an order. It was something in between, something unfamiliar even to him. Lena did not answer right away. She looked at Noah, at the small distance that had just begun to close, at the possibility that now existed where there had only been silence before. Then she nodded once, and in that quiet agreement, something greater than authority was established, not control, but responsibility, not obligation, but choice. And for the first time in that house, the future did not feel like something to manage, but something to learn. The house did not sleep that night, even though the lights dimmed and the long hallways fell into their usual quiet, because something had shifted beneath the surface, something that refused to settle back into routine, and Adrian Romano felt it with every step he took as he moved through the estate, his mind replaying the smallest details of what he had just witnessed. The subtle movement of his son's fingers, the almost smile, the way Lena had stood, without fear in a room where most people avoided even direct eye contact with him. He had built his world on precision, on control, on knowing exactly how each piece would move before it ever did. But this had not been predictable, and that unsettled him in a way no negotiation ever had. He stopped outside Noah's room, the heavy door slightly open, and for a moment he did not enter. He simply stood there, watching from the threshold as Lena sat cross-legged on the floor, a soft lamp casting a warm glow around them, the rest of the room untouched, distant, unimportant. Noah was in front of her, not withdrawn, not isolated, but engaged, his hands moving slowly, deliberately, as Lena mirrored him, guiding without forcing, responding without interrupting. There were no raised voices, no instructions spoken aloud, only movement, rhythm, presence. Adrian leaned lightly against the doorframe, his arms crossed, not in defense, but in observation, and for the first time he allowed himself to stay there without stepping in, without directing the moment. Lena lifted her hand, shaping something with her fingers, simple, clear, intentional, and Noah watched closely before attempting to copy it, his version imperfect but determined. When he succeeded, even partially, Lena smiled again, that same quiet acknowledgement that required no sound to be understood. Adrian noticed how Noah's shoulders relaxed at that, how the tension that had once seemed permanent began to loosen, and something in his chest tightened in response. Not from discomfort, but from recognition, a realization that he had been standing on the outside of his own son's world, not because he was excluded, but because he had never learned how to enter. "What is that?" Adrian asked quietly, his voice low enough that it did not disrupt the space they had created. Lena glanced back at him briefly, then returned her focus to Noah before answering. "It is a sign," she said. "For you." Adrian stepped into the room slowly, careful, measured, as if each movement carried weight beyond itself. "For me," he repeated, not as a question, but as something he was trying to understand. Lena nodded once. He needs to see you in a way he can recognize, she explained. Not hear you, not follow you, see you. Adrian moved closer, lowering himself again, this time more naturally, less rigid, until he was within reach but not imposing. Lena showed him the gesture again, her fingers forming the shape with clarity. Then she paused, giving him space to try. Adrian hesitated, just for a moment, the smallest fracture in his usual certainty. Then he lifted his hand and attempted to replicate the movement, slower than Noah, less fluid, but intentional. Noah watched. For a second, nothing happened. Then his eyes shifted, not away, but toward Adrian, focusing in a way that felt direct, unmistakable. He raised his own hand and repeated the sign back, this time more confident, more complete. Adrian exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and something inside him settled in a place, not fully, not completely, but enough to feel the difference. Lena leaned back slightly, allowing the moment to exist without her. And in that space, father and son remained, connected not by words, not by expectation, but by something far simpler and far more powerful, the willingness to meet each other where they truly were. Adrian did not speak again. He did not need to, because for the first time, he understood that silence was not the absence of communication. It was the beginning of it. Morning arrived quietly, not with sound but with light, thin lines of sunlight slipping through the tall windows and stretching across the polished floors, warming the edges of a house that had long felt untouched by anything gentle. And for the first time in years, Adrian Romano did not wake to urgency, to schedules or calls or decisions waiting to be made. He woke to stillness, and it did not feel like emptiness. It felt like possibility. He stood in the doorway of Noah's room again, but this time he did not hesitate. He entered without pause, his steps measured but no longer distant, and what he saw stopped him in a different way than the night before. Lena was already there, seated on the floor beside Noah, not directing him, not instructing, simply present, her hand resting lightly against the wooden surface as Noah explored the same rhythm they had discovered together, his fingers moving with more confidence now, less hesitation, as if the connection had not disappeared overnight, as if it had waited for him to return. Adrian leaned against the wall, arms relaxed at his sides, watching without interrupting, and Lena noticed him but did not break the moment. She simply shifted slightly, creating space again, always space, always invitation rather than control. Noah paused, sensing the change in the room, his eyes lifting just enough to register the new presence. And Adrian felt that brief flicker of attention like something fragile and rare, something that could not be demanded, only received. Slowly, he stepped forward, lowering himself onto the floor this time without being asked, without waiting for permission, mirroring what he had seen the night before, not perfectly, but intentionally. Lena watched him carefully, not with judgment, but with awareness, ready to guide if needed, but willing to let him find his own way if he could. Adrian placed his hand against the floor, feeling the faint vibrations that had become their language, and for a moment he did nothing else. He simply stayed there, allowing the silence to exist without trying to fill it. Noah's fingers moved again, tapping lightly, then pausing, as if waiting, and Adrian responded, slowly, repeating the pattern he remembered, his movements cautious but steady. The response came quicker this time, Noah's hand shifting closer, his rhythm aligning, not perfectly, but enough to build on. Lena's gaze softened, not with surprise, but with recognition, because this was how it worked, not sudden transformation, not dramatic change, but small, consistent moments that added up to something real. Adrian glanced at her briefly. Will he always need this? He asked, his voice quieter than it had ever been in his own home. Lena shook her head gently. He will always need to be understood, she replied. The way you reach him can grow, but the need does not change. Adrian absorbed that, his attention returning to Noah, who was now watching his hand more directly, more openly, as if the space between them had shortened just enough to feel less intimidating. And me? Adrian asked after a moment. the question carrying more weight than the words themselves. Lena met his eyes. "You will need to learn to listen differently," she said. There was no judgment in her tone, only truth, and Adrian nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he could not negotiate his way around. Noah's hand lifted then, forming the same shape Lena had shown the night before, the sign meant for him, and this time, Adrian recognized it without hesitation. He repeated it, more fluid now, more certain, and Noah's response was immediate, a small, unmistakable smile that settled into place like something that had always belonged there, but had never been seen. Adrian did not look away. He did not rush the moment. He stayed exactly where he was, grounded in something that did not require control to exist, and, for the first time, the house around them felt less like a structure built on power, and more like a space where something human could finally grow. By the third morning, the rhythm had become something the house itself seemed to recognize, not as sound, but as presence, a quiet shift in the way the air felt in the corridors, in the way footsteps slowed near Noah's door, as if people sensed that something inside that room was no longer fragile in the same way it had been before. It was growing, and growth, even silent growth, demanded attention. Adrian noticed it in small details first, the way the staff no longer avoided the hallway, the way conversations lowered not out of fear but out of respect, and most of all, the way Noah no longer sat motionless when left alone, his fingers now moving against surfaces, against tabletops, against walls, as if searching, as if expecting something to answer back. Adrian stood in his office later that morning, the floor-to-ceiling windows casting long shadows across the room. But his attention was not on the city below, not on the endless movement that had once defined his world. It was on his own hands, resting against the edge of his desk, repeating the sign he had practiced the night before, slower this time, more precise, as if trying to commit it not just to memory, but to instinct. He had spent years perfecting control over everything around him, but this required something different, something that could not be forced into place, something that had to be earned through repetition, through patience, through the willingness to be wrong and try again. There was a knock at the door, soft, measured, and Adrian did not look up immediately. "Come in," he said, his voice steady. Lena stepped inside, her posture calm, her presence unchanged, but there was something new in the way she carried herself. Not authority, not confidence in the traditional sense, but purpose, the quiet certainty of someone who understood the direction of something others were only beginning to see. Adrian finally looked at her, then at his own hands again. He responded faster today. He said, not as a question, but as an observation he needed confirmed. Lena nodded. "Because he knows you're coming back," she replied. Adrian absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the weight of it, because in his world, consistency was a tool, a strategy, a means to control outcomes, but here it was something else entirely. It was trust. "I want to understand more," he said after a moment, his gaze steady now, direct. Lena studied him briefly, not measuring him against power or status, but against intention. "Then you have to let go of needing to lead," she said. "With him, you follow first." Adrian exhaled slowly, a faint shift in his expression, not frustration, but adjustment, the kind that comes when a man realizes the rules he has lived by do not apply in the place he now stands. "I'm not used to following," he admitted. Lena's response was immediate, but gentle. "He is not used to being heard." The words settled between them, quiet but undeniable, and Adrian nodded once, accepting not just the statement, but the responsibility within it. Later that afternoon, he returned to Noah's room, not as an observer this time, but as a participant, lowering himself to the floor without hesitation, his movements more natural now, less calculated. Noah was already there, waiting, not passively, but with a kind of awareness that suggested expectation, his fingers tapping lightly against the wooden floor in a pattern that had become familiar. Adrian mirrored it, his response more fluid, more confident, and when Noah adjusted the rhythm, Adrian followed, not perfectly, not immediately, but willingly. Lena watched from the side, her role once again quiet, supportive, present without interruption, and, as the rhythm continued, something deeper took shape, Not just connection, but continuity, a shared understanding that did not rely on words, did not depend on explanation. It simply existed because both of them chose to remain in it. For the first time, Adrian did not think about time, about obligations waiting beyond that room. He did not measure the moment against anything else. He stayed fully, completely. And in doing so, he began to understand that what his son needed was not to be fixed, not to be changed, but to be met exactly where. He was without expectation, without pressure, just presence, consistent, patient, real. The next evening, the house filled again, not with the same careless laughter as before, but with something more restrained, more observant, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened and refused to allow it to be ignored. And Adrian Romano stood at the center of it all once more, dressed in the same precision, the same control, but not the same man. The guests returned with polite smiles and lowered voices, their eyes shifting more often than before, not just toward Adrian, but toward the hallway that led to Noah's room, toward the unseen space that had quietly redefined everything they thought they understood about power and presence. Lena stood near the entrance this time, not hidden, not entirely invisible, but still grounded in her role, her posture calm, her gaze steady, and she noticed the difference immediately, the way people looked at her now, not with dismissal, but with curiosity, even uncertainty, because something about her had changed in their eyes, not her position, but her significance. Adrian noticed it too, but he did not acknowledge it outwardly, not yet. Instead, he moved through the room with measured ease, greeting guests, listening without fully engaging, his attention divided in a way it had never been before, because part of him remained anchored elsewhere, waiting. When the moment came, it did not announce itself with sound. It arrived quietly, like everything that mattered in that house now. A small movement in the hallway, a shift in presence that only a few noticed at first. Noah stepped into the room, not guided, not carried, not hidden away, but walking on his own, his steps steady, his gaze forward, and for a brief second, the entire space seemed to hold its breath. Conversation slowed, then stopped, not out of command, but out of instinct, because something about the way he entered demanded attention without asking for it. Adrian turned immediately, his focus locking onto his son, not with concern, not with control, but with recognition, and Lena remained where she was, watching, not intervening, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Noah paused near the edge of the room, his hands resting lightly at his sides, then lifting slowly, deliberately, forming a shape that had once been uncertain but was now clear, practiced, intentional. Adrian did not hesitate. He stepped forward, closing the distance, and raised his own hand, mirroring the gesture with precision that came not from perfection, but from effort, from repetition, from the willingness to learn something that could not be mastered overnight. The exchange was simple, silent, but undeniable. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to interpret what they were seeing, because there were no words to follow, no explanation offered, only a connection that existed entirely outside the language they understood. One woman, the same who had whispered days before, glanced away, her expression tightening, as if confronted with something she could not dismiss as easily as she had before. Adrian lowered his hand slowly, his eyes still on Noah, and for the first time in front of an audience that had always expected dominance, he did not perform, he did not assert, he simply stood there, present, equal in that moment, not above, not in control, just there. Noah's fingers moved again, a small variation, and Adrian followed, not perfectly, but willingly, and the room remained silent, not empty, not uncomfortable, but full, filled with a kind of understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. Lena watched from across the room, her expression unchanged, but her eyes steady, knowing that this was not the end of anything, but the beginning of something that could no longer be undone. And as the guests stood there, witnessing a connection they had once overlooked, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one dared to reduce what they saw to something small, because in that silence, something greater than power had taken its place, something that could not be bought, could not be forced, only earned, moment by moment, through presence, through patience, through the quiet decision to truly see someone who had been invisible for far too long. The room did not return to noise after that moment. Not immediately, not even gradually, because something deeper than conversation had settled into place, something that made every word feel unnecessary. And Adrian Romano understood, standing there across from his son, that what had just happened could not be undone, not by time, not by habit, not even by the world waiting outside those walls. He lowered his hand slowly, his gaze steady, not breaking the connection even as the space around them remained filled with people who no longer knew how to behave because the rules had changed and no one had been told. Noah did not step back, did not retreat into the quiet distance he once hid behind. He remained where he was, his posture relaxed, his attention present, and that alone was enough to shift the weight of the entire room. Adrian turned slightly, not away from his son, but enough to include the others, his presence expanding again, but differently this time, not as something that demanded control, but as something that set a boundary without words. No one spoke, no one interrupted, and in that silence, something like understanding began to form, slow but undeniable. Lena remained near the entrance, her role unchanged on the surface, but everything about the space acknowledged her without needing to say it, because the proof stood right there in front of them, in the way Noah no longer disappeared, in the way Adrian no longer stood apart from him. Adrian took a step forward, closing the last bit of distance, and this time he did something no one in that room had ever seen him do. He lowered himself fully, not halfway, not carefully measured, but completely, bringing himself to Noah's level without hesitation, without calculation. The movement was simple, almost ordinary, but in that house, it carried more weight than any command he had ever given. A few of the guests exchanged glances, not confused now, but quiet, reflective, as if witnessing something they did not have words for, but understood all the same. Adrian raised his hand again, slower this time, forming the sign with intention, and Noah responded immediately, his own movement confident, clear, and for a brief second, their hands existed in the same space, not touching but aligned, connected through something that no longer needed explanation. Adrian allowed himself a small exhale, not relief, not victory, but recognition, the kind that comes when a man realizes he has spent years searching for something that was never meant to be found through force. He glanced once toward Lena, not calling attention to her, not elevating her position with words, but acknowledging her in the only way that mattered, with understanding. She gave a slight nod, nothing more, because nothing more was needed. The room remained still, not frozen but settled, and slowly, almost carefully, people began to move again, not returning to what they had been, but adjusting to what they had just seen. Conversations resumed, softer now, more thoughtful, and no one laughed in the same way as before. Adrian stayed where he was, beside his son, not rushing to reclaim the center of the room, not stepping back into the version of himself that had always stood above everything else. Instead, he remained grounded in that moment, present in a way that could not be mistaken for anything else. Noah's hand lowered, but his posture did not close, his attention did not fade, and as Adrian rose slowly to stand again, he did not leave him behind. He simply stayed close, close enough to be felt, close enough to be understood. And in that quiet shift, in that room filled with people who had come expecting power and left witnessing something far greater, no one dared to look at the boy and see anything less than who he truly was, and no one dared to look at the man and believe he had not changed, because that night, without a single word spoken aloud, the world inside those walls remembered what dignity looks like.